Hey everyone, Cynics here. It's finally time for a very special and important video. Today we're going to discuss one of the most basic aspects of illustration, design, and really just art as a whole, and that is shape appeal. Every object you draw is a shape, and this only gets compounded when you paint because every stroke you make also becomes a shape. It would certainly be helpful if we had some sort of guide for what makes some shapes look better than other shapes. This is an incredibly abstract and complex subject, but in this episode of Design Theory, we are going to start chipping away at this most basic principle of art. Let's get into it. The first thing to acknowledge is that there are no perfect rules for these things. I will give you some guidelines that will help you make better looking art, but it's up to you to know when you're ready to bend these guidelines or even break them. I'm going to start by defining a couple useful terms we can use when referring to shapes. Do you know the difference, say, between organic shapes and inorganic shapes? It has nothing to do with the subject matter. We're going to actually define an organic shape as any shape that has offset angles and curves. And of course, then an inorganic shape is just the opposite. So everything is very squared up and aligned. So if I draw a box, that is a very inorganic shape. All of the angles are perfectly squared to each other. Skewing the box slightly will offset the angles more and make it instantly more organic. And of course, further skewing can lead you in even more organic directions. The same thing can be done with circles, triangles, and really any shape or combination of shapes. Each can be warped into progressively more organic shapes. Now, being organic or inorganic isn't inherently special, but since our brains are built to detect patterns, the inorganic shapes tend to give off more individuality and read as stronger graphic elements. It is worth noting that most of the time when we're drawing things, we don't want the individual parts of an object to feel distinctly separate from the surrounding parts. Instead, we want to create flow. And that is going to be our second huge word to discuss, flow. This is also going to be our first key guideline to what makes an appealing shape. So we're going to use flow to refer to both individual shapes and how well they indicate some form of direction, and also how well shapes relate to an overall direction with their surrounding shapes. On the individual level, most appealing shapes create a singular sense of movement. We can represent this easily through controlled and continual tapering. So another quick example here, I can take a box and add a taper to it. Now it seems to have a distinct sense of direction. Of course, now would be a good time to remind ourselves that 90-degree angles often read inorganically, and that graphic individuality creates hard stopping points and feelings of separation, which is certainly no good for creating flow. Acute angles have a similar problem. While they can be used in organic shapes, the more extreme they are, the more they create their own competing sense of direction and flow. The ideal angles to use in a shape would mostly be obtuse. Wide, open angles allow for a relaxed sense of flow in an object. It's accessible, comforting, and obvious in its intention, which is coincidentally also why we associate sharp, pointy, angular things with villains and treachery. So on a subconscious level, our art will create more visual appeal with an overall reliance on chunkier, flowing shapes. So knowing that, even if you're trying to design some evil, pointy, angular-looking villain, you should still try to have an underlying sense of reliable and understandable flow. So, rewinding a bit, even that tapering box can potentially be improved by adding extra obtuse angles. And more complicated shapes can also be given more flow and visual appeal using those obtuse angles. Here's a quick test you can do just when you're creating any shapes. Imagine your shape was a top-down view of a room and it was filled with people. Now imagine one of them pulling a fire alarm and all of those people have to get out. Do they have a good sense of how to get out? Are some people going to get pushed into random corners and left behind? Look at all those poor people left to die in a needlessly complex shape. Whether your shape represents an abstract version of a C-curve or an S-curve, it should be doing its best to maintain some obvious sense of direction through a continual sense of tapering. And that tapering doesn't have to come solely from one edge. It can also come from a more central area if you want to give your shape two fire escapes. Now, it could be considered a part of flow, but another key guideline is going to be simplicity. Of course, good flow has good simplicity, but just to double down on our mental notes while we're drawing, constantly ask yourself, does this shape have flow? Is it simple enough? Or can I simplify it more? Simplification leads to comfort, and comfort leads to appeal. So flow and simplicity, they go hand in hand to lead us toward better art. I mentioned a lot about individual shapes, but let's actually get into putting shapes together because that's what's important. So flow should exist between separate pieces of the same object. In fact, good flow should lead to the visual combining of two pieces of an object into a continuous, singular overall shape. This is extremely important in anatomy and creature drawing, but really applies to every type of object. The more of a singular flow you can create in an object, the better. Now, all of this stuff also relates to big, medium, small, of course, so go watch that video if you haven't. You'll start to find that it's really wonderful when you can create flow between parts of limbs or torsos and heads or anything. One quick example I always enjoy is to draw a foot of someone that's standing on their toes. It can seem like a difficult challenge when you're starting out and really overthinking things, but once you take into account flow and simplification, it becomes elegantly easy and appealing. I was actually having trouble doing purposely bad examples because I've trained myself to always find the flow in shapes. But just trust me, it's the overcomplication of thoughts and ideas that can often lead to a lot of stumbling blocks in art. In that spirit, let's talk a little bit about intuition. It's a favorite topic of mine when it comes to making aesthetically pleasing art. I already made a video about focus, which relates to intuition a lot, but there are other important factors as well. One of which is tempo. But that topic is vast enough to get its own video, which will actually be a sequel of sorts to this video. And don't worry, I'm already kind of working on both of them in tandem, so hopefully it'll be out soon. Anyway, why did I bring up intuition? Well, as many things as I can just go on telling you about simplicity, flow, and obtuse angles, the best aesthetic outcome will come from committing these ideas deep into your brain and just letting them come out naturally. The best part about this subject as a whole, shape appeal, is that it's really just trying to deconstruct something that you already know. Your brain knows what looks good and what doesn't. If you see a cool design, you instantly know it. You don't need to analyze every factor that makes your brain enjoy it. That's my job. You just have to acknowledge that your brain already understands aesthetics to a degree that is far more complex and nuanced than any lesson I can teach. So while I'm digging through these abstract theories, you can still create amazing shape appeal by simply letting your intuition guide your hand more. How sharp should you make an angle? How large should a shape be? Should it be curved or angular? Your brain knows what looks good. You just have to find the right level of focus, tempo, and energy in order to let it come out. Well, that's most of the actual content I wanted to discuss, but I would like to do some quick practical demonstrations to help you all along. So back to the topic of inorganic shapes versus organic shapes, and how 90-degree angles and rigid geometry create hard stops and flow. Once again, that doesn't have to be a bad thing, so let's talk about how to use that as a good thing. There are indeed plenty of times when creating a hard stop in a flow is valuable and useful. For many industrial designs, it's perfectly reasonable and even preferred to give the silhouette a break in motion in the front, or the back, or top of the object. For instance, a quick spaceship design might want to create some hard borders that help define it in very clear and obvious ways, aka it can just be a box. For a gun design, this can even be helpful for defining a clear functionality to the prop. A gun with a simple boxed out front will quickly tell the viewer that the flow of motion stops here and there is no ambiguity about where the dangerous part starts and stops. This creates a very functional purpose to our brain's interpretation of shape language. A gun that creates no stop and flow at the front will generally feel less impactful and deadly. Of course, you can use that to your advantage if it suits your goals. Carrying forth with our examples, putting inorganic shapes and 90-degree angles in more arbitrary places throughout the design will just create disjointedness and a feeling of discomfort for the viewer. If your goal is to show a piece of the gun that needs to create its own distinct importance and stand out as a solitary thing, then yeah, a graphic design or inorganic shape language to break the flow of motion and draw attention to it could be great. Panel lines are the last thing I really want to hammer home because it is very rare that you would ever want to stop flow within an object using panel lines. This should be avoided at all costs unless you really know what you're doing. So please, no 90-degree angles and panel lines and decorative interior lining. Stick to nice 45-degree angles for now and you'll have a much better result. Just keep in mind all of that delicious big, medium, small theory as well. Hopefully you're getting a good feel for shape appeal by now and possibly starting to identify it easily on your own, as well as being able to identify when using inorganic shapes can be perfectly fine and when it should be avoided. I know most of you aren't very into industrial design, so let me apply the same theory to more general illustrative purposes. Inorganic shapes, in all of their graphic, flow-stopping glory, can be amazing at being used as a contrasting background element to really bring even more life into an already organic drawing. Muka was quite famous for doing this, but it really can be seen in all aspects of illustration, using graphic, inorganic shapes to draw in extra contrast on the organic flowing shapes. Anyway, I feel like that's probably enough for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe absorbed some good subconscious inclinations, which I will be discussing in more depth in the sequel to this video, which is all about tempo. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching, and as always, forever and ever, a huge extra thank you to the patrons that support this channel even in these slower months. Love you all. See you, everyone.